Before we get into it, there's an amusing thought that I want to share with you. Because Series 10, and I'm going with Series 10 as a sort of numbering thing here, has just finished filming.
We need to do proper nomenclature for how we're going to refer to these things.
Oh, I'm saying right now it's 8, 9, 10. Well, 8, 9, 10 upcoming.
So what I'm thinking of as Series 2 is 9.
Yeah.
Okay. And then 10 is just finished, has it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, what I love about Series 9 is that obviously they filmed it, it's all been done, and somebody is now the new Robot Wars champion. And that means that somewhere, presumably in the UK, maybe abroad, there is a person or group of people who have a massive Sir Killalot's Lance trophy that they can't display because it constitutes a spoiler for the new series. It's not an easy thing to have to hide, is it?
I guess all their friends and family will know that they're in Robot, because will know they're in Robot Wars. If I were entering Robot Wars, everyone and their gran would know that I was in Robot Wars, and then after it finished, they'd all be asking, how did it go? What happened? Like, what do you say? I can't tell you. You have to wait. You have to wait until whenever it airs, the end of the year, beginning of next year, whenever it airs.
Autumn, we're hearing, apparently.
So they've changed this. They've changed the sync of that. Will the stadium be less cold? Or the stadium, you know what I mean? The arena, will that be less cold now?
Yeah, because it's filmed in May instead of December.
Yeah.
So it's good news for flippers. It's good news for pneumatic axes. It's good news for humans.
Good news for anything with CO2.
Yeah, pretty much. Where do you stand on spoilers, by the way, for the new series? You're completely clean, I'm guessing, aren't you? Whereas I know a few things.
I know. I didn't until you mentioned it. I had no idea it was even being filmed. So that's how little I know about it.
My experience of your household is that it's very much a spoiler-free zone.
It is, generally speaking, a spoiler-free zone. It depends on what it is for both of us.
I've been shouted at before for sounding like I was going to spoil things.
We're both fussy about spoilers, but I think we're both fussy in subtly different ways. But yeah, I think I'm probably fine to hear a little bit about Series 10.
You're going to struggle with that so much.
I'm fighting two things. I'm fighting the numbering of these series, and I'm fighting the fact that it's a British TV show, and therefore it's a series, not a season.
I must say, I find it really interesting that you refer to them as episodes and not heats.
Well, because it's an episode of a TV show.
No, it's not. It's a heat of a sporting competition.
Yeah, but I don't watch sporting competitions, man. It's a TV show.
You do. You watch Robot Wars.
It's a TV show.
You see, that for me is one of the big debates about Robot Wars, because it's got to be run as a legitimate competition to work. There are people competing in it. And one of the big criticisms of, well, I was going to say Extreme 1 and Extreme 2, but they just don't count at all. But Series 7, for example, by the sounds of things, wasn't run as a fair competition. It was run as a piece of TV, which, considering they had prize money in place, was an awful thing to do. Whereas now, I feel like it's a proper competition again.
I'm fine for it to be run as a competition, and I guess you're right. I'm trying to think. I guess people don't talk about an episode of football, so it is. And now that I frame it like that, it sounds ridiculous. I watched that episode with Arsenal and Man United. Are they two teams that would, I was going to say fight, that would play each other? I know so little about football.
Hey, you were possibly right the first time.
Oh, God.
So, we're agreed it's Robot Wars Series 9 Heat A.
Yes, but I will get the nomenclature wrong constantly. I will do my best. Series 9 Heat A.
From here on in, we don't even need to say it. What we do need to do is get into the robots. Melee 1. We've got Rapid, Jellyfish, Nuts 2, and Terahertz. Which one do you want to look at first? Because we got a couple of old favourites. We got two very different new bots.
Should we just run down them in order? Should we do Rapid first? So I have some thoughts on Rapid. My initial reactions to Rapid is it's a very nice looking robot, which is to say that Rapid is immensely over-engineered. And when I first saw this, and they talked about it's the toughest robot in the thing, it's the most expensive, and it's really hard metal and you can't bend it, and that's immediately screamed to me, so you can't repair that then, can you? It just seemed like a silly idea. I think a balance of when you're building a robot, you need to have a balance of toughness and repairability, and I feel like you want to design in certain failure points. For a long time, I never understood why you'd put wheels externally on a robot until I thought about it a little bit more. And I thought, well, if you want to not be completely destroyed in a battle, you need to fail in a controllable way. So you need to not work when your wheel gets taken off, for example. And then you've got to hope then that the person you're battling is not Carbide and not a bit vindictive sometimes. So that once they've disabled you, or immobilized you, that's it. The battle is over. And then all you've got to do is stick your wheel back on. Whereas in Rapid's case, I see a lot of potential for them taking damage that they then can't fix.
Yeah. So what you've got with Rapid, I can't remember the team captain's name, but he runs an engineering company called RPD, hence the name Rapid. He was making a ton of money at a very young age and has kept it going. So that's where the financing comes from. It's also where a lot of the work has been done. He himself is not necessarily a robots guy, but he's an engineering guy with resources and time. So everything's been custom CNC'd. That's where most of the sort of supposed cost of the robot really comes from. In the team, you've then got his partner, who again isn't necessarily a robot person, but then you've got the driver, bloke called Andy, can't remember his surname. And he's been pretty big on the featherweight scene. He's won the featherweight championships a bunch of times. So it's an experienced driver, who's probably quite an experienced builder as well, taking on a heavyweight for the first time. So you expect a bit of naivety, potentially. But they've built a beautiful machine. It's got a lot of potential power. I still don't know what it means when they say 7 tons of force on a flipper. But that's more than anyone else claims, so it must be good.
I would love to know how they measure that. Something I will say about their flipper is that it has a really long reset time.
Yes.
Or it seemed like it in their group battle. It's a robot called Rapid, so I guess part of that, I assumed it was because it was a quick robot, but maybe if it is just because of the name of the company, then good for them. But you think with a flipper, especially when you consider once that flipper's up, you've basically got a big hole in your robot where there's no armour or very little armour, and so I feel like you'd want your flipper to go up and then come back down quite quickly. But it was often seemed like it was up for a good 3 to 6 seconds almost, just like gaping mouth, which seemed really odd to me.
Yeah, that might be something to do with the cold as well. I think that might sort of give you issues with the, I don't know the proper terminology, the sort of gas exhaust system. Maybe that was part of it. They had a lot of bungee on that return, so it obviously needed quite a lot to bring it back down.
Yeah, I would like to know more about how that return system works. All I can say about it is it's slow, and you're right, there's a lot of bungee there to push it down again, or pull it down. But it seemed to be lifted up and then stay fixed quite firmly at its highest point for a while before almost slamming back down.
Which makes me think it might have been an issue with the sort of gas evacuation. I don't know the proper terms for this. But beautiful machine, very high quality components, full Hardox shell, lots of titanium inside. Very, very well designed thing, but complicated.
Yeah, it was amazing to see inside it as well, like the size of that ram that they've got, or that piston they're using to lift it. That is a beautiful piece of work.
It's just engineering porn, isn't it? And then we have Jellyfish, the complete opposite.
Yeah. Jellyfish. My first note here about Jellyfish is pointless demonstration piece.
Really? Tell me more.
Well, it seems to me that it's been built just to prove that you can build a robot with no tools, which is great. It's sort of, oh yeah, look, you can get in on this. You don't have to spend £25,000 and custom CNC everything. You can go and get an angle grinder and some bolts and cobble together something. I call it pointless demonstration piece because I have mixed feelings about robots that clearly can't win. And there's 2 of them in this battle, and Jellyfish seems like the more pointless of them because on top of it being very, very cheap and not that it's not well built, but it's not like a fighting robot in this way. And the other part of that is that weapon cannot possibly be effective.
Oh, I'm going to have to argue with you on a few points here.
But how much force can you seriously put in a linear clamping system like that? That seems insane to me. It just seems like a really ineffective. If you wanted to build a grappling control bot, which I think is great, please do that. I like seeing the variation. But I feel like if you're going to do that, you want something a bit more like Dead Metal. You want big claws that sort of actually come in, as opposed to this weird, wimpy-looking linear clamp.
Allow me to address your points one by one.
Go for it.
First of all, I would agree with you with this idea of, just making it to prove you can do it isn't the right thing to do. And if they'd gone out and tried to make a big flipper on the cheap, or a spinner on the cheap, I would completely agree with you. But what they've done is come up with a fairly unique idea that worked within their means, and I completely disagree that it's not got potential to be effective. It's a control bot. It's not about doing damage, it's about taking control. And the way they've done that could work. The issue they've got is that they've got motors that were cutting edge in about 2002, And they haven't used that much of the weight allowance either. So in those terms, it's not as effective as it could be. But I think it's really good to see unique designs. It's good to have fun teams around. Dave Laurie was with Team Nuts last year. I really like the bloke. And they've done well with what they've got. I think if you have a field full of rapids and carbides, the whole thing becomes inaccessible really quickly. But having something out there with big googly eyes made of plastic, with stickers all over it, I think is good for the sport.
You're right. It does need some of them. I'm just having a quick look through. I don't like jellyfish. So that robot could be more effective. You're right. If they put more money into it and if they used more of their weight allowance, I think it could be more effective than it is. But I seriously feel like that design of clamp is fundamentally not the best thing to do. I don't get that. I don't understand why you'd put something that is, even if you poured all the money in the world, I don't see how a linear clamp is the best way of controlling another robot.
It's not the best way, but it's a way.
But it's so...
Well, you see, not everyone is going to be there with the hopes of winning the full title. If that was the case, then 39 people are going home unhappy. For some people, they will go there. First of all, they're delighted to have qualified, and they'll want to win a fight. And I think that's valid. Especially, I mean, obviously, Dave Laurie himself isn't a complete newcomer to the sport, but if you want newcomers coming through, you need to let people feel they don't have to be there to be the best.
You don't have to be there to be the best, you're right. And so this sort of ties in with the next robot on our list is Nuts 2, which I think is another robot that falls into this category of a silly robot that will never win. And I think that's fine. One of my favourite robots from the early series is Dietor. I really love that robot. And that's another, just a silly robot that caught fire every single time it went into battle. And it never, as far as I'm aware, never really won much.
It beat Tornado, to be fair.
It did, it was not like the most ineffective thing in the world, but like it was that kind of...
It also won a tag team tournament, I seem to recall, or did very well in one.
Oh, I'll get you, mister. I have an eidetic memory for past battles. My point is, I do appreciate having the sillier robots, the more friendly-looking robots and these things, but Jellyfish doesn't do it for me. It just doesn't. A big part of me and the things that I like is often comes down to aesthetics. I like things that, like we said, like Rapid is a beautiful piece of engineering, and I really appreciate that. Jellyfish is not. So like it's like that's just plastic that's been bolted together, and it's great that you can do that. It's great that you could build a robot that can qualify for Robot Wars, but it's not qualified on the merits of being a good fighting robot. It's qualified because the BBC want to make a point, and that's fine. But I think like Nuts 2 fulfills that role, and I think Nuts 2 is better in many ways.
You're clearly chomping at the bit, so let's get on to Nuts. Not a sentence I really planned out, I'll be honest.
Chomping at the bit for Nuts. Go on.
I feel like you're massively underestimating Nuts.
No, I'm not. You're wrong.
Okay, and this is one of those things where you're going to be able to go, oh, but it went out really quickly.
No.
It's a fantastically innovative machine. And there's something that they never got a chance to talk about or show that I think you've missed. Do you know what I mean when I talk about Melty Brains?
Melty Brain? I do not.
So, Melty Brains is a system that allows a robot like Nuts to sit and spin, but then also have controlled translational movement while spinning.
That's interesting, and they can do that.
Yep, so there's an onboard, probably an Arduino, something like that, which is making tiny adjustments to the speed of each motor to allow it to move while spinning. If that is working, you have got a deadly robot on your hands.
That is very clever. I did not know they could do that. I would love to see that in action. You're right. I have underestimated them. I take my earlier statements back. I still don't think they're ever going to win, but that's very impressive. Actually, that's a very cool. Yeah, I was wrong. That's very cool.
It's something that's been around in sort of amp weights and the lower weight classes for a while. I think it's the first heavyweight to have it. So you've got a 3-meter wingspan with 2-kilogram flail head spinning at 500 RPM, and it can come at you. Suddenly, that's looking a bit more dangerous.
Yeah, that's definitely more dangerous than I thought it was, where it was just the best they can do is spin in place and then hope that someone is stupid enough to come towards them. I think that's interesting that they can move. I'd be interested to see how fast they can move.
I think there's some footage of them testing it out there. Not quickly, but not slowly either, would be my summary.
That's interesting. I occasionally think about what I would do if I were to build a robot to enter Robot Wars. And something I've more recently considered is, what if you had a robot with a spinning bar on it, but that had omnidirectional wheels on it, so you could translate left and right without having to rotate the robot. And I guess they're very close to doing that with Nuts too. That is
Kind of, yeah, actually. The difficulty with Omni wheels is that they can't support much weight. So we had, what was the one last series? It wasn't Edward Scissorhands, I think it was.
Did that have omnidirectional wheels?
Yeah, it had Omni wheels on it, but it was only about a 40 or 50 kilo robot. There's one there's quite a few lightweights that use them. In America, there's a robot called Mega Melvin, which looks really interesting, which is Omni wheels and a big brushless powered axe, which I would be very excited to see, but I haven't found any good footage of it yet. So it's an idea that's out there, yeah. But for now, Nuts is the best you've got, I'm afraid.
So I've got a lot more respect for Nuts now. I feel like that must be a very technically difficult thing to do. So that is cool. And they still fulfill, in my opinion, the role of being a bit of a ridiculous robot. But they're still also very clever. See, I think they're just better than Jellyfish. I think they do Jellyfish's job. They do Jellyfish's job, but far better, in a far more interesting way.
1 out of 2 ain't bad. I've turned you round.
I wasn't going to hate on Nuts all that much. I was just sort of going to say, my big point was they're like a new Deer tour.
That's a good thing.
That is a good thing. And I think they're much more of a new Deer tour than Jellyfish is, because Nuts 2, I think, has, especially in the light of new information, can definitely seem to be more effective than Jellyfish ever could be.
They're also far furrier.
Yes, I do like their jackets and stuff. That's quite funny.
The other thing I have to give them some credit for is that the mini-bots are coming along quite nicely as well. I think it's Rory Mangles, the guy who does all the speed controllers and things in that team, and lots of other stuff, I'm sure. He has said that there's no reason why they couldn't build a mini-bot that's powerful enough to push a heavyweight. So if they come into another series with something like that, they could become an even more interesting team. But for now, they've got the 3 tiny ones to run around and be a nuisance and get smashed, which is also fun.
Is it in this tournament, or is it in an American one where there's a robot that is split very cleverly around the weight limit?
I think you're thinking of Crackers and Smash. And they are in this series, yes.
Okay, we will not talk about them now then.
No, we shall forget they exist. There was also Creepy Crawlies in BattleBots, but that was a group of 4 or 5. That was different. That didn't work.
So, should we move on to a robot we can talk about?
Yes, and one that we definitely can't call stupid.
No, Terahertz is a wonderful robot. I love this robot so much.
It's like a really angry limpet.
Yeah. I really like the team. I really like John Reed. I think the robot is a wonderful piece of work again. I think it's a really wonderful design. Once again, it's got that like, aesthetically pleasing thing about it. It's got this sheet of metal on the front of it, and then the polycarbonate, is that right?
Yep, 12mm polycarbonate all over, plus that 6mm folded Hardox sort of front shield.
Yeah, and the axe and stuff. I do think it's wonderful. I really loved seeing in one of the pit sections, there was a wonderful view of the way that axe is fired and the way that articulation works, and that's gorgeous. That's genius.
I mean, it is quite an old system, fair. Thor uses the same system. I feel like a few others do as well. Tomahawk looked like it did. So you've got the pneumatic ram with gears in it onto a rounded gear. That's not a good explanation.
It's a pneumatic rack and pinion almost. It's got this rack that is fired out pneumatically onto the base of the axe, which has got cogs on it, so they interlock and shove that axe around with an amazing amount of force. And that's not how I would have thought an axe works. I've always assumed they are electric or some other way of doing it. I've never considered doing it with a pneumatic ram like that. Or that's why I don't design robots. It is amazing.
We've gone through this evolution of axes in Robot Wars, where to start with you had stuff like Kilotron, which was literally running off of an electric motor pretty much directly. You then went to stuff like a Dominator 2, which was a pneumatic system, but almost working a bit like a flipper would, in that it was sort of actuating a lever. Then you've got this design, the sort of rack and pinion, as you say, and what we're seeing now, and Beta, John Reed's robot in BattleBots does this, is a brushless motor to a snail cam to a chain to another snail cam. If you get online, go on to Beta's page on Facebook or whatever, if you look at that system, it's artwork. It's beautiful. It is just, glorious. But in terms of the terahertz axe, we've got, again, a ton of force, whatever that's supposed to mean. You're looking at about 100 mile per hour impact speed just in the time it's taken to come over. So the acceleration on it is mind-blowing.
Yeah, and I bet it would be more mind-blowing if the arena wasn't so damn cold.
Yes, absolutely. Another victim of the cold.
Yeah, like I said, anything that's pneumatic is so negatively affected by being in a cold room. It's unfortunate. You can see how much it frustrates the people who build these things that their robot is not performing at the optimal strength. It's not doing what it should be doing. And you can see that's immensely frustrating for them.
We especially had that in Series 8 as well. For Series 9, they have at least let them store their gas bottles somewhere warmer. But back in Series 8, you have people walking around the pits hugging their bottles, trying to keep them warm, just to try and get things to work. But onto the melee, I suppose. I have a bone to pick before we go into this. I don't know if you spotted this, but Jonathan Pierce made a Tinder joke, and I'm not okay with that.
Swipe right on Matilda. I find that really funny. It's amazing to me how quickly and how thoroughly social media will penetrate general culture.
Imagine how long it took to get to Jonathan Pierce as well. He doesn't seem like he'd be on the cutting edge of social media.
I'm perfectly fine with the Tinder joke in there.
That's fair enough. One thing I hear you're not okay with is the Wilhelm scream in the intro.
Wilhelm screams, man, are everywhere, and I have a love-hate relationship with them. Because it's, on the one hand, it's quite funny that they're everywhere, and I get that a lot of sound engineers and the people editing this put it in there as a bit of a joke, because it's a bit of a joke in the industry. Sort of, we've got a Wilhelm scream. They're also immensely distracting. Once you know what they sound like, you can never listen to something that has it in it without immediately noticing the Wilhelm scream. So they are quite distracting. There's a few in Star Wars that drive me up the wall, just because they're so freaking obvious. But anyway.
Into the melee, and I think the first thing I have to say is poor old Nuts never stood a chance. They went in with a motor not working. They had to be helped to their starting position.
Did they? That wasn't shown.
No, it wasn't. Lots of these things aren't, and that does slightly annoy me. I heard something along the lines of Dead Metal helped them in or something, and has done that for a few other robots as well. But they had to be pushed into place, because obviously they don't let people in the arena once everything's turned on.
No, you wouldn't. I can understand how in later rounds, I can understand why you'd need to be pushing robots in, because obviously they've been through a lot at that point. But yeah, to be pushed in on your first bout is a bit alarming. That is a shame.
I understand it was something like just a speed controller failure, the kind of thing that you could swap straight out, but they want you in the arena right now. It's a shame, fair play to them for going on with the fight anyway. I'm sure there was possibly a reserve that could have gone in there instead, or they could have just gone ahead with 3, but they've gone in there knowing they don't stand a chance, knowing they might get smashed up. So fair play to them for doing that.
It's quite funny, because I feel like if any other robot went in like that, if Rapid or Terahertz, if Terahertz went in to the battle with one wheel not working, I would know immediately. You'd go, that's not working properly. But with Nuts too, I didn't even notice that anything was wrong with it. I just assumed that was operating as intended, which clearly it wasn't.
To be fair, the only reason that I really knew was that I was expecting to see the Melty Brains in action. But when you watch, you can see that they're spinning in fits and starts, and they're sort of pivoting around that wheel that's not working.
This is the first time that we see the Rogue House robots. It's when it gets introduced, which I quite like. I have mixed feelings about the pit in Robot Wars, and it's quite nice to see that shaken up a little bit, to have a bit less guaranteed pit action in there. I quite liked the idea of a Rogue House robot. I feel like it was in this episode, or maybe a later one, the pit looked like it reset. It got put down at some point, and then someone hit it again later, and the Rogue House robot came out, and the pit reset. And I don't know if that was intentional, or if that was a weird accident, because I never saw it happen again. I only saw it happen once. As an idea, I think that's great. I really don't like that the pit can go down soon, and then it sort of like eliminates almost a quarter of the, unless you're a good driver, it eliminates almost a quarter of the arena. I don't like the fact that the pit ends a battle immediately. I think it's a really rubbish way to end a fight or win. So I quite like that there's the Rogue House robot. I like that there's this new thing that could happen. I do quite like the stick thing, the indicator, to be, if you hit the button, one of two things may or may not happen. So that's quite cool.
The Rogue House robot is a great idea because it doesn't eliminate the pit, but it adds that element of danger. And without the pit, it's not Robot Wars, it's BattleBot. And I think you need to have the pit there just so that more designs become viable. So something like Tornado or Storm 2, which are both robots that I loved in their day, they wouldn't have worked without the pit. Some people would take that as an argument against the pit, but for me that's a positive. I like seeing a variety of designs, and by having it there, it gives people more options.
I think that those robots could be equally effective without having the pit, what ends up being a Deus Ex thing. It's just sort of, it frustrates me when a robot that should win gets pushed into the pit or is pulled into the pit and then they're out. That annoys me. It bothers me that it's like that. But you're right. It does help make it Robot Wars.
The other thing, of course, you have in Robot Wars that makes it Robot Wars is the House Robots. So seeing them more involved is brilliant. There was, however, up until the last minute, intended to be a third option for that button.
Interesting. What was the third option?
The so-called Fog of War. Now, we're not quite sure what that means, but you can kind of guess. So it sounds as though the idea was that there would be, presumably CO2, released into some part of the arena to obscure it. That sounds awful. I don't want that.
That would have been rubbish. That would have made for rubbish television, if nothing else. That would have been rubbish.
Something's happening. We can't see what.
I mean, I get frustrated enough. It's much better in this series, but I get frustrated enough when the camera is not accurately following the action, and to have it deliberately obscured by smoke would make me want to throw things at the television, I think.
I'm glad it got dropped. The carryover from this, however, is that it was not, and this is from people doing sort of analysis at the end of the series, it appears to have not been a 50-50 chance Pitt versus Roguehouse Robot.
Come on, man.
It seems to have been 66-33 in favour of Roguehouse Robot.
Really? The data set must be so small. How can you... I want to see the data for myself before I agree to these things.
That's fine. You seem like you are very well equipped to go out and get that data yourself.
Yes, but I feel like the data set must be so tiny, because that wasn't hit very often. It wasn't as if that was in every round. I feel like with a data set that small, in concluding 60-30 or 66-33 or whatever, that concluding those numbers is within the margin of error, I would have thought.
I think the thing is, they're seeing 66-33 from a thing that used to have 3 options and now only has 2, as a kind of smoking gun.
It's it is a very specific percentage, so...
But I would rather see Roguehouse Robot more than the Pit. I think it adds the correct element of danger.
Yeah, I agree.
The dial, however, is a little bit chintzy for me. I'm not a big fan.
How would you display that, though, man? You've got to have a way to display this that reads well on television and that the people fighting can see.
I've got a crazy suggestion. If it's the Pit, then you can let people see the Pit go down. And if it's the Roguehouse Robot, you turn on the fancy disco lights and people see that. Also, audio cues. Bear in mind, for the Roboteers, an audio cue is far more useful than a visual cue because they're looking at their robot.
But like the point of the dial is to read on television. I think that's the primary thing is something that reads well on television, and I think the dial achieves that. It's why there's a massive clock in the back of Countdown. Right? It reads well on television.
2 things that have never been compared before and will never be compared again. Countdown and Robot Wars.
Look, they're very similar.
Should we talk about the melee now?
There's one more bit of just like pre-fight stuff I would like to go through, which is that the rules have been made clearer, I think, in that they tell the rules quite clearly at the beginning. It's a 3-minute fight. If a robot's immobilized for 10 seconds, they're out. They also have a clock in the lower left of the screen, I think, that I'm not sure was there before. I think in earlier series, as far as I can remember, it was not there until the last 30 seconds or something, but it's there the whole time. And they do a much better job of having a timer on screen, and I think also to the contestant when they're being counted out, which I really appreciate.
Yep, so the way it's working now is that good old Noel Sharkey is sat there with the other judges with a little button in his hand to start a 10-second countdown on a robot. We needed that. It's displayed to the competitors. Again, as a sport, it helps a lot. You are getting the fair outcome more often without having to backtrack on decisions. We don't want a Gabriel versus Beast situation again, where they're not sure if it's a mobile, they don't hit it anymore. It was just a mess. So yeah, they've dealt with that really well. And I must say, I think that as a whole, a lot of viewer criticisms have been responded to in this series. I think the lighting's better, the editing's better, the sound is better as well. So there's a lot of big improvements, even just showing in this first episode. So, we've got Nuts not working. The other 3, however, are going at it pretty well.
Yeah, it was quite a good fight.
Rapid was a disappointment, I thought.
It wasn't too bad. Other than the really slow reset, I thought it did all right. It got involved, it flipped people a little bit.
It did, but bear in mind, you've got this 7 tons of force, the most powerful flipper in the competition, getting under one of the lightest robots in the competition, and not throwing it that impressively high.
No, it wasn't quite an Apollo throw, was it?
And that's the thing, Apollo has less power, but it's got a longer flipping arm, so it's going to get a better launch. So for them to come out sort of as the best flipper in the competition, we didn't really see that at all. One thing I will say, very well driven, extremely well driven, and that was good to see.
I think it was. I think it did all right. I agree that its flipper was maybe a bit disappointing if you think about it a lot. I don't really pay much attention to the stats when they put them up there. So like 7-ton flipper is just a number that I ignore.
Well, the team claimed that they could throw a transit van 1 metre in the air.
That is a bold claim.
But they were throwing jellyfish less than 2 metres in the air. Now, I don't have a degree in physics, but I do reckon that 1 jellyfish is probably less than half a transit van.
The other thing I think you've got to remember, though, is that there are many things that you could flip with a powerful flipper. You could probably flip a transit van 1 metre. under very specific conditions. If you have the flipper in exactly the centre of mass of the transit van, or maybe they're thinking more, we could, in theory, lift a point mass that weighs as much as a transit van, that's in the middle of our flipper, a metre in the air. But that's a very different task than actually flipping a transit van. It's almost a difference between, in physics problems, you have a point mass on a line with no friction and all that rubbish. Whereas in the real world, it doesn't work like that. And I think that's probably what's going on here. I reckon they could probably flip the mass of a transit van a metre into the air, but not actually flip a transit van.
I have a second and far more realistic theory, which is that they're so rich they sent a transit van and the robot to the moon and did it there. Because everything's lighter on the moon.
It is lighter. It weighs less. It's just as massive, but it weighs less.
My favourite involvement from Rapid, and this comes back to your issue with how quickly the flipper comes back down, was them managing to get a hold of one of Nuts' chains and just drag them around for a while. It made Nuts look far more mobile than they actually were.
Yeah, that was quite funny. That is definitely a downside of having the gaping mouth on a robot.
Turned it from a flipper into a control bot. It was probably one of their best periods of the fight.
And definitely intentional.
Oh, of course, it was their plan all along. We do then get, by far my favourite moment of the episode, poor old Nuts being launched out of the arena by Matilda's flywheel.
Yeah, poor thing.
It's a beautiful hit. It's 2 hits in one.
I do like vertical spinners just for that. They are quite cool.
Now, I'm trying to think, and I'm hoping you've got a bit of knowledge here. I can only think of one other time in Robot Wars that a spinner has put something out of the arena, and that would be Exterminator in Series 7. Can you think of any other ones that might have?
Well, you are pushing the limits of my memory, because while I did watch the older series, that was a long time ago and I've not watched them since. So I can't think of anything. That's not to say it didn't happen, but I can't really think of another time that's happened. But I guess the thing with a vertical spinner is again, you've got to. I imagine anything with a vertical drum or a spinner of some description could do it, but I think the conditions need to be very, very right to do that, and I think that's much harder to do with a spinner than it is a flipper, because obviously with a flipping bot you can get under them, lift their drive wheel, and then push them around a little bit before flipping, whereas with a spinner you flip them at the point of contact and you've just got to hope.
That brings me back to something with Rapid actually as well. I did notice that when Rapid flips things, it tends to send them straight upward, which isn't particularly useful because A, they land on you, and B, it's not very good for getting someone out of the arena.
No, but that'll be, again, a consequence of having a very short robot compared to something, or a short flipper as compared to Apollo, is that I imagine once they're under the robot, they're probably flipping. The point of contact is probably, well, it must be, to do a vertical throw is the point of contact is under the other robot's centre of mass, which I think is probably much harder to do with a longer, steeper robot like Apollo. So I reckon the technique with Rapid is probably just to get just under the edge of a robot and not actually lift them in any way, and then flip them almost as soon as you get under them, so you're flipping them from the side, which I think would result in them spinning more than going high. If
that's what you're aiming for, why not build a front hinge?
Well, can a front hinge throw things? I don't think I've ever seen a front hinge throw things in a particularly impressive way. I think it tends to be a much slower flip, doesn't it?
Firestorm got out of the arena. Okay, it was lower walls, but it was also a much older robot.
Yeah, I say these things not to say they can't be done. I just think it's less likely with a front hinged flipping thing. I also imagine it's much harder to get a front. If you think the speed of the actuation of Rapid's flip versus the equivalent thing with a front hinge, I bet it's much harder to get that speed out of a front hinged robot and still have control and not send yourself into forward somersault if you misfire.
Yeah, what I find really interesting as well is that we're barely talking about terahertz.
I don't think it was that involved in this, was it?
Not really. All they really did was chase Rapid round at the end, which was fantastic and needed the Benny Hill music.
Yeah, that was funny.
But they didn't really need to get involved. Jellyfish kind of conked out after being thrown around a bit. Nuts wasn't working in the first place. Rapids weren't really a big threat to terahertz. Terahertz aren't that bothered with flippers.
I mean, this is the thing about these pointless robots. So in this, not pointless. with these pointless robots, they are pointless. Jellyfish, Nuts too, pointless. They achieve nothing. Is that you get a default win for Rapid and terahertz, whereas in the second bout, you've got far more effective robots. I feel like they should have swapped, for example, Tomahawk and Nuts 2 or something, I feel like if they'd done that, you'd have slightly more interesting bouts here, whereas because you've got Jellyfish and Nuts 2, neither of which are really going to win. It's a default victory for Rapid and terahertz. All they've got to do is do exactly what they did, which is drive around a little bit. And the other thing about terahertz, though, is it was in this one where they, at the end of it, they were saying that their axe wasn't firing properly. Maybe that's why they weren't too involved.
Yeah, they had a bit of a sticky cylinder by the end of it, didn't they? I think the big thing you've got with this melee is a bit of producer interference, because they wanted Jellyfish and Nuts 2 in the same melee, so it was the old teammates. It's a bit of plot, isn't it? And that annoys me. Whereas the next melee was much better balanced. Well, I say better balanced, you got 3 vertical spinners, but it was better balanced.
It was definitely better balanced. Sabretooth, Tomahawk, Cranky, and Aftershock. Much more exciting fight.
I wanted them all to win. I like all of these robots a lot.
Yeah. Let me so I need to go and look up to remind myself what the hell these are less memorable to me. Tomahawk especially.
How can you not remember Sabretooth? It's a beautiful machine.
Sabretooth I remember. It's like I said, it's Tomahawk that's the one that I've bloody Google images now, and I've Googled the letters TMHWK, which Google has successfully figured out is Tomahawk, and is now showing me pictures of Tomahawks, not of the robot that I want to see. Google is being too clever. Yes, Tomahawk, that one, with the axe. They claim they can do, was it like 3 or 5 different types of hit with that axe? I don't understand what that means.
I imagine it's similar to the system that Eruption uses in terms of they can vary the power of the hit.
Why? So I can understand why with Eruption you'd want to vary the power of a flip. Why would you want to vary the power of a hit? Why would you want to do anything less than full power?
I've been thinking about this and I've only got one theory. So imagine you're a boxer. Not every punch that a boxer throws is meant to be a knockout. Because if you try and throw a knockout punch and miss, it puts you in trouble. So a full power hit from them is going to use a lot of gas, and it's potentially going to cause a bit of damage to the robot itself if they miss. So I imagine what they've got is kind of little jabs for when they're not sure they're going to hit something. But if they've got an opponent stationary or well positioned, they'll go for the bigger hit. That's what I assume.
I don't buy that. And with your boxing analogy, I can understand not doing knockout hits on every punch. But why would you not doing that? You've got to do a bit of tactics. But the difference there is that you are directly controlling your hands. Whereas with this, you are having to think, am I likely to hit this robot? No, I'm not. Let's do this hit on this button or whatever it is, however they control it. And I feel like that takes a lot longer. And so I feel like if you're making that decision every single time you try and hit someone, surely you're much more likely to miss. I mean, I can understand, sort of thinking about it now in terms of like tactical hits, like big and smaller ones. Maybe you might have 2 types, so there's only 2 buttons, and it's when they're stationary, we can come and whack them really hard. But most of the time, maybe let's do 80% power. But like they were talking like more than 2 different types of hit. I think it was either 3 or 5 or something silly like that. It's like, what on earth can you possibly do with 5 different types of hit from a blunt instrument? I mean, come on.
Here's what I'm thinking. Big hit forward, little hit forward, reverse hit, because they've got a pick that fires backwards, remember? And self-righting. I'm wondering if they're the sort of lines they're working along.
Yeah, but like, you don't count self-righting as a type of hit, surely. And there's no... I don't buy a backwards hit. I'm looking at a picture of it, and unless you're fighting a very tall robot and are willing to slam your axe into your own body, you'd never use the back of that thing. I can understand, because they talk about having the 2 different things. You've got like a piercing one and a blunt one. And I sort of assume that like the other robots that occasionally change weapons out, it's just a case of swapping the axe head around before the fight, and then right now we're committed to piercing, more than this is something that we can fire in both directions.
I mean, the axes don't really go for penetration anyway nowadays. They're there really as hammers. So I suppose the bit they're hitting with doesn't even really matter. It's about transferring a large force. But it's an interesting design. It's quite well armoured. They've got the big 15mm HDPE panels, which weren't effective, let's say.
That was torn to pieces, wasn't it?
But the body shape and the drive layout really confused me. So the body shape is like the old sort of, which one was it that wasn't in this series? Oh, Velociriptor. That's what it reminds me of, if you remember Velociriptor. It's a really weird shape. It's really easy to get under from the sides. It's not going to sit nicely on its top to self-right. The drive wheels are in the middle, which seems slightly strange for that design of robot. There's just a lot about it that doesn't make sense to me.
I think the middle thing makes sense. If you imagine you've got like the 2 drive wheels in the middle and then casters at the front and the back, you can spin on the spot.
But you can do that with the skid steer system that's 4-wheel drive and get better traction out of it.
Yeah, but maybe there's not the weight allowance or the space inside there to do a 4-wheel drive system.
That would be the issue, yeah. They've tried to make it quite compact. But yeah, I never had very high hopes for it, but I do like it. I like seeing international competitors. And I like axes. I really want to see axes and hammers do well, even though they don't really fit the meta nowadays. So that's Tomahawk.
So should we... you mentioned Sabretooth a second ago, which you said was gorgeous. I'm looking at it. It is a very cool-looking robot. I do like it.
Now, I love drum spinners. Minotaur in America has made me love drum spinners even more. You've got a 25-kilo drum running at 9,000 RPM on a brushless motor. That is a dream to me. It almost had a flamethrower, but the insurance people said no. That would have made it the best robot ever.
That would have been quite a spectacle.
It's Gabriel Stroud. We all love him. Still hadn't won a televised fight up until this point. He makes a new robot every single time. He's got pieces of the old one on this one. It's everything I love about Robot Wars.
It's a cool robot. My note here is simply one note which says standard drum spinner. I don't think there's anything spectacularly innovative about this. I think it reminds me of Minotaur, like you said. I think it's just, it's a drum spinner. And it's exactly the kind of overarching shape that you'd expect from a drum spinner. It's a low rectangle with 2 wheels on it.
With a lot of aesthetic frills, though, and that, for me, counts for quite a lot. I would say, if you're going to compare it to other drum spinners, you could argue that it's actually slightly substandard, because the way the drum has been put together is a little bit ghetto. So look at something like Minotaur, and they've got that kind of teardrop shape to the drum in profile, whereas what Sabretooth have done, the easy way of doing it is that they've put teeth on both sides, half length each, or 1/2 and 2/4 technically, to balance it, which is an easier way of doing it. It's a cheaper way of doing it, but it's not as good. But it's still a drum spinner, and drums are amazing.
Indeed. Cranky, the ostensibly spinner-proof robot. Whenever someone comes along and says that they are spinner-proof, you have to go, you're wrong. There's nothing is spinner-proof. And this is another one that I think could very easily be left on its front.
Yes. Now, that's a valid criticism for Cranky. I love the design. As an attempt at a spinner killer, I think it's really good, as long as you're coming up against horizontals.
Well, even against horizontal spinners, it fell apart immediately. It hit a spinner, and those 2 big scoop things got torn off.
It was more... I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves here.
We are, but I'm right. You know I'm right.
It's a big Hardock shield. It's shock-mounted. It's a good idea. Whether it's been executed well, we'll get into, but as an idea and a design, I really like it.
I do not.
It's also running on brushless drive, using the wheels from Pussycat.
This is the team that made Pussycat, isn't it?
In part, yeah. So it's Robin Herrick. He's been in Robot Wars since the very beginning. He built Body Hammer in the first series, if you remember that. The weird little copper thing with literally a lump hammer. Made the final. Was pretty good. He's been in with a few teams. He's done quite a lot. Really knows what he's doing, but was rubbish last series. But it's a 22 kilo asymmetrical bar, 6,000 RPM. There's a lot of damage potential there.
If you say so.
It's easy for you to make this argument because you know you're not going to be proven wrong afterwards.
Yeah, we should maybe do one of these things where we record it while we're watching it and then pause it after the introduction. Have a conversation about how we think it's going to go and then watch the fight. But yeah, you're right. I know how it turns out.
So, Cranky, done. Tomahawk, done. Sabretooth, done.
Aftershock. After seeing Shockwave in the last one, and I did not like Shockwave, I was very dubious about whether or not I'd like this robot. I'm so glad I didn't do a push bot. I know Shockwave wasn't completely a push bot, but it effectively was a push bot. I'm very glad that they've got an active weapon this time, and it's really cool. What I don't understand, and this happens quite a lot, is that they talk about, we've been developing this robot for 10 years, and I can understand an idea, maybe mulling it over for 10 years, or maybe you're counting your experience of building robots as part of your development towards Aftershock. But then they say, we've not tested it. It's like, how can you be developing something for 10 years and not test it? That seems insane to me. And then later on in the show, there's another little interview section. He talks about how at the end of the last series, he wanted to come and design a different robot to come into it. So he started designing, the night he got home, he started designing this robot, which means it's not been in development for 10 years.
Okay, here's what he means. Will Thomas and Ian Thomas have been fighting lighter sort of classes for a while. They've had a series of robots called Inertia. The best one was a featherweight, which came third in 2011, which was a vertical disc. So they've gone through some iterations of that. So when they say that it's 10 years in the making, they're talking about this general sort of body design and weapon design that they've become used to and have learned to do well.
But they've not been designing this robot for 10 years, have they? They've not been designing Aftershock for 10 years. They've been designing it for 1 year.
Go look at Inertia and you'll see the similarities.
But if you're saying Inertia is a bloody featherweight robot, they're not the same thing.
They've pretty much scaled it up. It's the sort of thing that the producers probably liked them saying, but it's got truth to it. It comes from a place of truth.
No, this is like politician talk.
When you talk about testing it, there is footage out there of them doing spin-up tests. But that was with the old brushless system they were using. So they were using a big Rotamax, but it burnt out before filming when they were testing it. So they replaced it with a LEM instead, which they've worked with a lot before. They're easier to use because brushless can be tricky and all of that. It gives them better startup torque as well, which means it's better for self-righting. So they hadn't tested it in that format. They had tested the disc for things like balance, but the other thing that you really can't do at home safely is test having weapon and drive working at the same time, because that's a ridiculously dangerous thing to have.
I get that. This is another one of those things where you're talking about, like the producers are putting people together in the first bout to sort of give that narrative of the team fighting itself. And then in this one, it's sort of, I get that it's dramatic. It's sort of 10 years of development, not tested, both of which are maybe technically true, but they're implying something that is grossly untrue, and that bothers me. It's like, this is not a robot that's untested. There's a difference between untested and we've not driven it and spun the engine at the same time. It's, when they say, this is an untested robot, it gives the implication to laymen that it's not, they've never turned it on, which is just ridiculous. It's a ridiculous thing to claim.
And that is where it's TV over sport. But I can get over that because I see through it, so that's fine by me. But as a design, regardless of how long it took, Aftershock is in its own way beautiful. I say that Sabretooth is beautiful because of the sort of aesthetic choices. Aftershock is pure function.
It is. It really exposes an interesting thing about these vertical spinners, and to a lesser extent the drum spinners, which is the gyro effect, the gyroscopic precession when you're turning that thing, and you can see it when it's moving. When it spins, it lifts up, and I always wonder what's the is that worth it? Is the power of a vertical spinner worth the loss of control that you get? Because you can't drive that thing nimbly when that weapon's spinning.
Aftershock has been quite well designed to minimise that. If you look at the sort of base of it, you've got quite a large gap between the wheels and the outside of the bodywork. And what that means is that as it turns and as it tries to sort of turn itself over, it can only go so far, which means it doesn't sort of gyro dance as much as a lot of other designs do. So even that has been thought of. It is an issue with vertical spinners, but they're worth it.
It is a cool robot. It has been designed with that in mind. Like, it's a very wide wheelbase. It's big in the dimension it needs to be big to stop it from flipping side to side and stuff. So it is good. It doesn't mitigate it as best as they can, but it's still a compromise that I would not personally go for. I don't think I'd do a robot that I couldn't turn with the weapon spinning.
That's fair enough. It's powerful, though. 24 kilo disc, 500 mil, 2,400 RPM, 2 seconds spin up.
That is very impressive.
It is. It's destruction porn is what it is.
Melee 2.
Interesting house robot choice. A house robot that we're going to see a lot of this series in Shunt. The only thing that can in any way handle these spinners. So, start us off.
Cranky, the spinner-proof robot, falls apart when he gets hit by a spinner. That's what happens in this battle. That's my big note. That's the thing that's circled, is the spinner-proof robot almost immediately falls apart when it gets attacked by a spinner.
The issue with a so-called spinner-proof robot is that it has to be driven well, and it has to keep the spinner-proof part pointing towards its opponent.
Yes, and you're right, you mentioned earlier that it's probably much more effective against a horizontal spinner, but even so, to come onto this show and say, I'm spinner-proof, and then almost immediately get torn to pieces by a spinner is quite funny.
No one saw the vertical spinners coming, though, did they? They saw Carbide, they armed up against that, and suddenly you've got Aftershock there waiting for you. It was unfortunate, the melee is a situation where you can't turn and face an opponent. They had Tomahawk one side, they had Aftershock the other, and they maybe made a poor decision about which one they were going to go for. But they've been rightly eviscerated. It only took 3 or 4 hits. They're tumbling all over the place. They're being hit in places they don't want to be hit, and it's over for them.
Yep, torn to pieces.
But much like last series with Killicranky, taking Razor down with it, it's done some damage to Aftershock in that Aftershock have run too much current through their weapon system. So they're now basically done weapon-wise at this point.
Yeah, that's another thing that always surprises me about these robots is how often they have electronics failures.
Untested.
The thing is, you could know the rating of the motor, you know the maximum power draw of that motor, and then you add 20%, and then you build all the supporting electronics around that current. You put really big wires in it, you put a really big speed controller on it, or whatever it is that needs to be drive their motor. It surprises me that it happens as much as it does. That they've got a weapon that draws too much power and burns something out. It's another one of those things where I guess I'd be a much more conservative builder of robots. I would build things to always be within their tolerances and within their limits plus a little bit, because I think it's the worst way to go. To lose your robot because it drew too much power. It seems to me from the outside that it's such an easy thing to design around. It baffles me that so many teams push the limits in these ways.
I feel like the issue may have been that they had to swap out the weapon motor quite late on. So I would imagine that power system has been put together for a brushless motor, which is probably drawing lower current and lower voltage for the same output. So it might be they overlooked that. I'm just spitballing again, though. I don't really know. What we do know is that it hasn't cost them in the end, and I'm very glad.
Yeah, it would have been a shame to see them go because of that in the early rounds.
Meanwhile, of course, we've got Sabretooth just systematically chewing its way through Tomahawk.
Yeah, that was quite entertaining to see. Turn them literally into shreds.
Yeah, just those little leaves of HDPE coming off the side. And then, of course, I suppose it was already dead by this point, but the blow that then took one of their front forks off and sent them flying towards a camera. But they have ended the battle, thanks to Shunt, kind of tipped up against the edge, so I'm not sure they even realised they were through.
No, they didn't, did they? They were like, we need confirmation that we're in. They were quite surprised that they did that.
Now, here's the question. Gabriel Stroud, builder of Sabretooth, all-round legend, at this point had not won a televised fight. Does getting through this melee count as winning a televised fight?
I would say no.
I agree, but why?
These feel very much like heats. They feel like qualifiers. It's like you don't say, oh, the Formula One driver won the qualifying. I mean, I guess maybe you do, but it's not the same as winning the race. You know, it's like, oh, you came first in the qualifying. You've qualified for the interesting fights at this point. That's how I see it. So I wouldn't say that it's winning in the way of like, oh, we've won a fight. I always think of fights as a one-on-one, and this is not a one-on-one. So.
It's a survival situation, isn't it? It isn't a winner, it's two survivors.
Yeah, and given how so much carnage happens in these things, so that it's often just a case of not getting in the way, and I wouldn't call that winning. I think you could win one of these rounds by not being involved, which robots have done. It's a tactical thing of like, we're just going to stay out of this as much as we can, and two other robots will take themselves out, and then we are in a better shape for the real fights later on.
I must say, I think we can safely say, and this isn't the case for all episodes, that realistically, the four best robots have probably gone through. As much as I love Nuts.
Yeah, you're right. The four best robots did go through, I would say. Tomahawk, interesting, but not up to scratch with these things. Jellyfish and Nuts I've talked about, and Cranky again. I just, I think it's an ineffective robot.
I wanted to see Cranky in some one-on-ones. It didn't happen, but we got to see Sabretooth and Aftershock instead, so that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, a one-on-one against a robot that's close to what they've designed for would have been interesting. It would have been interesting to see, are they spinner-proof against something like Carbide, for example?
And that's what you really want. You want to see something like that come through and trouble one of the big boys.
Yeah, I would love to see a robot that Carbide can't immediately tear into two.
Well, Terahertz, to be fair, last series. That brings us nicely into Terahertz versus Sabretooth. The first of the head-to-heads.
Yeah, this is where we saw the amazing look at their weapon firings at the beginning of this, which was very cool.
As John Reed squirted lube all over the place to get it working. He has a wonderful way of saying the word lube.
He has a wonderful way of saying everything.
He does, to be fair, he does.
He's a very listenable chap. But also, in fights, very aggressive. He was right on Sabretooth, right from the off, straight, and he said he would do it as well. He said, straight in, let's try and do the damage.
And John's a very good driver as well. So is Gabriel, to be fair, but John especially is a great driver. He knows the strength of his robot against any kind of spinner is to get that front wedge in and keep them on there to get some blows in. And he's put some good dents in that sort of top armour of Sabretooth.
He did, yeah. He did do some very good driving until he drove into a wall and lost his tail.
And that's it at that point. That is battle over.
Yeah, without that tail, he's got nothing to push against. It's an interesting... that must be like a consequence of weight limitation, to just have the only thing that's holding the back of it when you're firing it is this little tail. It's all I can... Because otherwise, why is the chassis not longer? Why is the wheelbase not longer to do this? And it must be weight.
Also an element of spinner proofing, because having a long, flat side is quite an attractive target for a spinner, whereas having the angles everywhere does work quite well for him.
Yeah.
The thing is, Sabretooth couldn't do any damage to that front scoop because it was riding up it. As soon as that was a millimetre off the ground, which it is without that tail, it's all over. And we got to see some grade A damage from there on.
Yeah, that was also really funny to see John yelling, "Wait for it!"
Wait for a good hit!
Because at this point they've lost a wheel pretty much, haven't they? They're sort of stuck. This is another situation where I think there's some dubious interpretation of the rules in this fight, because Terahertz is, I would argue, immobile for a long time. They can't move out of their radius. They are spinning around their one wheel that's broken, and they can't fight unless Sabretooth gets in the way almost. It's sort of like, I think they were that fight went on for a lot longer than it should have done at this point. Once the tail was gone, once Sabretooth had done the damage to their armour, taken that wheel out effectively, it was like that's battle over. Terahertz can't move. They're not in control of that robot anymore. It can't move outside of its own radius. The timer should have started much sooner than it did, if it started at all. I can't even remember.
I completely agree. Sabretooth, really, in its first good attack, has done the damage. It's gone in and taken the tail off. It's then gone in on that rear left. It's shattered some polycarbonate and it's got in at that drive. But Terahertz has managed to get out of there. And there's not been any more hits to that area. So I don't know where the rest of the damage has been done. They obviously got in and hurt that area. But I don't know how it's ended up being completely immobile on that side.
Well, they must have just like nicked the wheel or something, or maybe, a bit of that polycarbonate got jammed in the drive or something. But yeah, I mean, it couldn't move. And like I said, I would argue completely immobile from that point on.
Absolutely. And the one thing that really did finish it was, as I say, our first sight of the Roguehouse robot. Bit of shunt action, which actually did some quite bad damage to Terahertz.
Yeah, because it hit Terahertz right in its weapon system, didn't it?
Yeah, right in the ram and put a ding in it, which of course, if you've got a thing that is meant to be holding a lot of pressure and it's now got a nick in it, that's not a good situation.
Yeah, well, yeah, you've got a precision engineered piece of equipment that's all of a sudden a lot less precise.
All the lube in the world isn't sorting that one out.
No.
I mean, obviously they managed to repair that or replace that or whatever, but that's one of those times where that extra damage after the fight should have been ended has potentially limited that robot's effectiveness thereafter. So yeah, definitely should have been called earlier.
It's always a shame to sort of see this sort of like dubious implications of that. And I feel like it was after this point that the because Terahertz did they, I feel like they got one final hit on the drum of Sabretooth and shattered it.
I'm not quite sure what happened there. The drum shattered while Sabretooth was underneath Terahertz.
Okay, so it wasn't like they got a hit on it.
I don't think so, no. It might have been a nick caused by an earlier hit that then went, because obviously you've got 20-odd kilos at 9,000 RPM. Any imbalance to that is going to start causing problems. But it doesn't help. The material, I can't remember what material they made it out of, but it has a history of shattering when used in drums. I think Will Bales from BattleBots has had one of these drums shatter. And he's good mates with Gabriel. So Gabriel should probably have known better.
Yeah, probably.
It did, however, lead to one of my favourite moments in the whole series, where Esme from Sabretooth asked if they have another drum. It's just, nope.
That's a heartbreaking moment. It's like, well, that's that was sort of that was the nail in their coffin almost as well. It's sort of like this battle, although Sabretooth won, it kind of ended it for both of them.
Which is a massive shame, but talking of ending it for people, Aftershock versus Rapid. This whole battle and the aftermath is just an arena of schadenfreude for me. I loved every second of this fight.
It's just, it's the story to tell to say, don't over-engineer your robot.
You got Rapid in their VT showing off the size of their valves. They got one good flip in. Was it in this VT where they've got the penthouse view over what I presume to be London with their completely clean desk with 2 MacBooks on it or something, and that's sort of it. Like I said, their whole presence exudes a certain kind of. I think there's an arrogance that comes across that I'm certain has been manufactured by the producers.
It must have been, because in the last one, in Series 8, there was the Foxic guy.
Yeah, Craig Danby's a lovely bloke. He helps out everyone in the pits. But they made him the heel.
I only knew that after the series had gone, and I was reading the subreddit after that series, and people were saying he was really badly portrayed. He's a really nice guy, but he was shown to be such an arse.
Yeah, we'll get back to Craig Danby later on, actually. He's going to come up. So into the fight. Rapid have got in under Aftershock quite well. They get a good flip in, but the disc has got them righted immediately and started pulling up the floor. The start of the theme of the series.
So you've just said that they self-righted, and Jonathan Pierce said that as well. Like, they've proven their self-righting, and they haven't. They hit a wall and happened to land on their wheels. That's not self-righting. I really don't like the fact that they've proven that they can self-right. I just don't think they have. They were not upside down. They were in the air. They bounced off a wall on the floor and happened to land on their feet. Good for them. And then shortly after this, I feel like because of Rapid's ridiculously slow reset on their flipper, they end up with the disc of Aftershock catching that flipper and ripping it up. I feel like that must be what did the damage to the piston. Was it just being like forcibly the flipper being forcibly yanked up when it wasn't meant to be?
I don't think the piston is actively attached to the flipper. I think it's, what's the best way to describe this? It's think of an analogy or another thing that works this way. It's contacting against it and pushing it up. And from there, it's free to go further, but the bungees prevent that. So I think Aftershock, it's lifting the arm off of the piston, not pulling the piston up.
Okay.
What I think it probably did do was exacerbate the problems they've got with the bungees returning it, which is why when they end up upside down, they're not self-righting.
They just jammed up and were left upside down and then couldn't fix their robot because it got dented and that's it. It's so ridiculously over-engineered that they can't do anything with it.
I've watched that fight a few times trying to work out what hit it was that damaged the gearbox. And I don't really see any times where Aftershock has gone in on their side very heavily. I think there's maybe a little nick, but it's to the left side, not the right side, and it's the right side they're having problems with.
Yeah, but if it's just something's been dislodged, it could be a really tiny fix. It could just be a case of, one little thing is a millimetre out of alignment. But like you said, if that's buried in a robot that you can't take apart, that's enough. That's it. They're done.
Yeah, it didn't help as well that they only discovered this late on in their repair time. They were busy repairing the flipper and didn't even think about the drive. One thing I do wonder, it's a 4-wheel drive robot. I wonder if they could have got it working on 2-wheel drive and just got it out there. Literally chop off an axle if you have to. Just get it out there.
I just don't think their robot is modular enough. I think I almost feel like it's engineered to be one solid lump of metal. And anything that breaks in there, you almost need to rebuild the bloody robot to fix it. It's just over-engineered. It's too much.
It genuinely wouldn't surprise me if they entered Series 10 and turned up with a whole spare robot. Just like they do in Formula 1. In Formula 1, they have a spare car for each driver.
Yeah, and they've got the money for it.
Yeah, they have the resources to do that. Whether that would be allowed or not, I don't know, but I could see them doing it.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a limit on spare parts.
Well, to be fair, there's a lot of sort of part swapping that goes on in the pits. And Rapid did actually donate a speed controller to Jellyfish to get them working in their place. So again, this comes back to they're being made out as bad guys, but actually they're sort of being part of the Roboteer community, and they're doing good. And now we get on to Sabretooth versus Aftershock.
Yes.
Can we call it Zombie Sabretooth at this point, or do we need to wait a bit longer for that?
Have they belted it back together again? Is this the one? Because they shattered it in the drum in the last one, so they've got it belted together this time, which was amazing.
It is an incredible repair they've done. I think it's Al, the elderly engineer of the team, who has hand-forged rings of steel. It is the most old school repair imaginable, and it's gone in and it's spun up. That shouldn't happen. That shouldn't have worked. That is amazing, and it's the kind of thing that you wish Rapid had been capable of.
Yes, you do. Aftershock struggled to do damage to Sabretooth.
Are you thinking of the same fight here? Because Aftershock eviscerated Sabretooth.
To begin with, they struggled to get a good hit on them. I feel like in the early parts of this fight, they were sort of flicking near them and they weren't being caught and thrown, I don't think.
I think what you've got on Sabretooth is a lot of sort of ablative and disposable bits of aesthetic armour. So a lot of what we saw in the start of that battle was those being knocked off. And it wasn't until they started getting through them and into the guts of the robot that we saw big damage, where, the top is starting to hang off, there's wiring visibly hanging out. That's when it really went wrong. So they have tanked the first couple of hits, but Aftershock is a beast.
It is, and it raises a question of what is the etiquette here for destroying robots, for tearing a robot a new one?
Again, this is one of those points, and I feel like I'm really banging this drum a bit too hard, this podcast, but I think there's a lot in the edit that makes this look worse than it was. I don't think those hits were as late as they looked. I think the cutaways to the teams have been used to make it look like there was a much bigger period of time passed. One thing that wasn't shown is that there was quite a lot of damage also done by the house robot. So when you see Sabretooth coming back in a heap of pieces with a tyre hanging off, not all of that was done by Aftershock. So, in the aftermath, where Sir Killalot is toying with them, Sir Killalot has run over one of Sabretooth's speed controllers that was hanging out and wrecked it. And that's the big expensive damage that's really been done. So I think, again, it's a bit of editing magic to show Aftershock giving it a couple more taps than it should, and then show this pile of pieces on a trolley, when there's actually missing information. But the one thing we should be taking away from this as Robot Combat fans is that Aftershock is a beast.
Yes, it's really good. It's good to see another really big, competent robot that can do a lot of damage. It's doing well. It's nice to see.
So from a highly destructive fight We move on to Terahertz versus Jellyfish.
Yeah, so Rapid had to retire. They couldn't repair their robot because they built a stupid robot. And of all the robots to replace them, it had to be Jellyfish, didn't it? It had to be the cheap rubbish thing. And I bet the BBC loved that because they got to do the whole, the £25,000 robot replaced by a piece of rubbish. And then they show that little clip. We go to see them building it and all that kind of stuff. A bit of background on the team. And the guy, what's the guy's name? The guy who's done Jellyfish?
Dave Laurie.
He's talking about the usual rubbish. I'm not an engineer, and that means that I bring a unique perspective, and that gives me an advantage because I'm thinking outside of the box. It's wrong. It's like, yes, you're not an engineer, and it's wonderful that, a non-engineering person or someone who's not technically an engineer can come and build a robot, but two things. One, you must have an engineering brain to build a robot. There's no way that someone who's not even remotely interested or wired to do engineering is going to build this robot. So you are an engineer, in my opinion. And saying because I'm not qualified, that means that I have these outside the box ideas that engineers just wouldn't have is bollocks, because engineers are paid to have outside the box ideas. It's the whole point. That's what makes a great engineer, is that they think about these problems in a different way. So it's infuriating to me to say this. It's just infuriating to say that. It's wrong.
I suppose what he's really trying to say is that he doesn't have the university education in engineering. That's what he's trying to say.
Into the battle. One hit and dead.
Yeah.
So to continue my barrage against Jellyfish, it's rubbish. One hit and dead. I mean, come on.
John Reed has got what he wanted. In the Sabretooth battle, he wanted a good hit. And he certainly got a good hit in the Jellyfish battle. They've basically struck the armour right above one of the speed controllers. It's hit so hard it's popped one of the chips off. And that's it. That speed controller was also apparently in some way required to transfer power into the receiver. So rather than just losing one wheel, they have lost everything.
Yeah, that's called a battery elimination circuit.
Ooh, tell us more.
So I've recently been messing around with remote control things, and a lot of speed controllers have this battery elimination circuit. So a speed controller will plug into your receiver through 3 ports, and instead of then having to power the receiver separately with either a separate circuit with its own voltage regulator or a separate battery, it will draw power from the speed controller. The speed controller, instead of accepting 5 volts on one of those pins, it will give 5 volts to that bus, and then you can power the receiver and any other servos and stuff that you've got attached to that receiver from that thing. So there's a whole circuit that's no longer needed. You don't need to have a separate power rail with its own voltage regulator anyway. It's all built into the speed controller, and it's a very useful thing to have, but it does obviously is a single point of failure.
Yeah, so that sounds like it's really useful if you're trying to, for example, minimise weight or minimise complexity. But is it a risk you want to take in a combat robot? Or do you just have the extra stuff?
The thing is, so it's wonderful in airplanes, which is why I know about it. But it's also probably it's cheaper. It's just cheaper and easier. It's a less complicated thing to do. It's like, well, I've got this component, I plug it into the receiver, and now the receiver's got power. All I need to do is put 12 volts into the speed controller, and we're done. Whereas if you have to power that separately, or you want to power that separately, you've got to either have a separate battery at the correct voltage, or you've got to take your 12 volts and you've got to put it through a voltage regulator that takes it down to the 5 volts or 6 volts that the receiver might want, and you've got to choose a voltage regulator that's not going to pop. You've got to make sure it can deliver enough current through it. You might need a heatsink on that thing, and a bunch of other stuff. It is, it adds a bit of complexity. And if you're trying to build a robot on the cheap with little complexity, that's what you do. I'd also argue that that's what someone who's not an engineer would do. But great outside the box thinking there. But I'm sure he's learned his lesson. I'm sure next time he builds a robot, it will not have a battery elimination circuit in it. It will have a separate power supply. To
be fair, I do know that ahead of applying for Series 10, Dave Laurie did do quite a lot of work upgrading and sort of modernising Jellyfish in terms of the internals. So maybe that was part of it.
I would hope so, yeah.
Should we move on to 2 robots that presumably meet your high standards?
2 well-engineered robots.
Built by engineers with engineering skills.
Terahertz versus Aftershock.
What a fight. What a fight.
Oh, yes.
Once again, it's very much a question of driving. Terahertz showing once again that front wedge is very effective against spinners. They can't get under it, therefore they can't get into it. And for all the time that his driving is good, that is fine. Until the one moment where he decided to turn his back to it and he gets taken apart.
Was it when he turned his back to him? Because he was on the flipper, and like Aftershock was right up against them. They were glancing off the front of it, and then the floor flipper lifted terahertz up a little bit, and then that's what allowed Aftershock to catch the bottom of the robot and send it flying.
I could have these out of order. That was definitely the first big hit.
That was sort of, I feel like that's where the tables started to turn, I feel.
And can I point out that in that moment, Aftershock sent terahertz higher than Rapid sent Jellyfish. It is probably the highest we've seen a robot go this series. It is a huge, huge hit.
That was a big, yeah, you're right, that was a really big throw.
There are fantastic photos from afterwards where the Aftershock team looked on the tooth of that blade and they found little shards of Hardox that had basically welded themselves onto it that used to be part of terahertz.
That is impressive.
It's why modern robot combat is brilliant. That level of power. It's, you got, 6 mil Hardox just with a huge chunk taken out of it. That shouldn't happen. That shouldn't be possible.
But it is possible. What did you think of Terahertz's strategy? The don't use the axe.
It makes sense to an extent. I can see why, if you were attacking from the side, you wouldn't want to use the axe, because it's going to take the kind of hit that's going to bend it to either side. I'm not sure he brings a spare for that. That's a big bit of kit. The axe head itself should be fine. It's titanium. It's on a slight, a flexible enough arm that if it did get hit, that would take a bit of it as well. But if you're front on to that robot, you've got very little to lose by using that axe.
Yeah, it was an interesting choice to say, right at the beginning, don't use it. It's sort of like I don't know what his strategy there was.
He was so angry at Nick, the weapon operator, for not getting good hits against Sabretooth. They just didn't trust him anymore.
But I mean, this is just the competitive side of me coming out. Like, what's the strategy here? What's the win condition? There is, if you don't use your weapon, there is no win condition. The best you can hope for is to last 3 minutes. It'll be a judge's decision that you will lose because you didn't use your weapon. So, I mean, you're going to get no points, and all you've gained is not being damaged. And at this point, then they've not got points anyway. They're not like, I don't know. It just seemed like a really odd thing to do. I can understand sort of being like, be careful, only fire it when we're head on, only fire it when it's good. Don't be taking like the Hail Mary shots at this robot in the hope that you happen to do something. But don't use it at all. Seems like an odd strategy. Yeah,
they're going out and hoping that it will break down. When actually, late on, they've lined up a really good shot at that drive belt. It just so happens that they've been so badly smashed up in the intervening time that there's only a little spasm left in the axe. If they get that hit in early, it changes the fight.
If they got an axe straight down the middle of that robot, they would be they'd be much better off. That would be a game-changing move.
And also, very importantly, at this stage in the competition, it's pretty much win or go home for Terahertz. So the risk is kind of minimal. But I think that John Reed, because he has been working on that robot for so long, I wonder if he's a little too attached to it in a sense.
So the battle was over. Terahertz upside down, axe useless, couldn't self-right, that was it.
Probably a fair result in the end, really.
Yep, I think the right robot won. I do like Terahertz. I think Aftershock is a better robot. It was a good fight though, like it was a spectacular throw in the air, and it was, it wasn't too drawn out, it wasn't too short. It was good. I enjoyed it.
Meanwhile, we've got drama ongoing in the pits as Team Legion try to get Sabretooth back together. Now, I said earlier that Craig Danby was going to come up. I know that he was one of the people who was really instrumental in getting that work done. So I feel the need to shout him out once again for being a good guy. What I find really interesting, he said in an interview somewhere that if you go on the website and look at the sort of promo photo of him with Foxit, he looks really, really dirty. Are really sweaty. That's from doing the Sabretooth repairs. So they've done a good job getting it back together.
It was amazing. I mean, it's like battle of scraps. It's just amazing to pull that robot back together. And I can't believe they spun that drum up again. I just can't. It's amazing to me that you would do that.
It's amazing that they've been able to, but they've done 99% of the job. And they've got it running backwards.
And they've got it, so unfortunate. And you could sort of remember when I was watching the fight, sort of seeing that must be running backwards. That's not acting in the way that it should be acting. And it's just such an easy mistake to make and so unfortunate.
Now, I'm confused by all of this, because my understanding is that weapon has got a brushless drive, which means that it must have a speed controller, which means that they must be able to run it in reverse. Does that sound fair?
No.
Okay, tell me more about why I'm wrong, because I trust you that I'm wrong.
So I've got experience with precisely one speed controller in my life. And the way the one that I've used works is you've got on one side of the controller, you've got two big wires, one for power and one for ground, and then you've got the three little control wires, which is a power line, which is what goes back to the battery elimination thing. You've got a ground line for that, and you've got a signal line, and a signal line is what comes from the receiver. And I think it's probably fairly safe to say it's just like an analog signal or something like that. That's just like all it's telling it is a speed at which to spin, and that's all that tells it. It's got no sense of direction. And then on the other end of it, of this speed controller, you've got three unmarked wires that you have to plug into the three unmarked wires on your brushless motor. And if it's spinning the wrong way, you need to take any two of those wires and just swap them around, and then it will spin the right way. So it's a hardware thing that they did wire it wrong to have it going the wrong way, and there's no way of changing that in software. There's no way of like inverting anything anywhere else to be like, actually spin backwards. It's one direction based on the way those three wires are connected.
So with this kind of brushless speed controller, you can only rotate in one direction.
Yeah.
Presumably there are other types that allow you to do both, or else people wouldn't be using brushless drives.
I guess you'd not use those fancy ones on your weapon system.
Yeah, I suppose you reduce complexity where you can, don't you?
Because like you'd think that with a drum that's designed to spin in one direction, there's no reason to ever spin that the wrong way. There's no reason to do it. So like the speed controller must just be we're going to go in one direction, going to spin it in that, and that's it. That's what I imagine happened. I mean, the fact that they said we wired it the wrong way and they couldn't change in the battle, they must have realised when they were fighting. And I feel like if they could have done anything in their transmitter to change it, then they would have done. But
so my understanding is they realised as they tested it, but it was too late to change it. They had to go in with it.
Well, they even more evidence to suggest that it's the speed controller I've just described. It's the one with the three wires that you have to get the right way around. I mean, most of the transmitters, I imagine, are quite programmable. I mean, you can invert them, take each channel, and you can invert the way that it's going effectively. And if their speed controller doesn't support that, then there's nothing they could have done. If it was like, we've realised while we're testing it, but there's no time to change it, I feel like surely the rules aren't so draconic that you can't go and reprogram your transmitter.
Oh, of course not.
I mean, maybe they are, but that seems unlikely to me. I think it must have been that they had the wiring wrong, which is unfortunate.
But the good news is they have still got a working weapon, which from the position they were in is a minor miracle.
It's amazing, and like you sort of said, amazing help from the people in the pit to get that back. You can just sort of see and you can see the emotion on the guy's face when he's talking just before the fight of sort of like, I can't believe it's there, I can't believe you've done it. And you can just sort of tell that as well, there's just this huge push from the community to get that robot out, which I think is amazing. I really love to sort of see that thing of, they're all fighting and harsh talk and stuff while they're in battle and stuff, but behind it all, they're all being wonderful human beings.
It is a good little community of people. The fight itself, I'd say not that much to write home about, really. We see Jellyfish's weapon kind of in action.
I'm not convinced that centre thing ever moved. Maybe it did. Maybe this is my bias against that robot coming out again. I think it was a fight of grappling, and I think most of the time, while it sort of seemed like Jellyfish had the whole like control bot thing down, but I think just because of the way Sabretooth's drum was spinning, they always ended up on top of Jellyfish, which is not really Jellyfish having control.
And if it had been running the right way, they've ended up underneath it, so either way, it kind of doesn't end well for Jellyfish. But they've not taken a lot of damage, they've got control for times, okay, they haven't got the traction to really do anything with it, but they have got that control, and that's been enough for the judges. Yeah,
I think it was, judges' decision. I predicted, when that fight ended, I predicted they'll go for Jellyfish, and they did, which I think is the right decision.
And it hasn't really affected the overall scores either, because it's still a Sabretooth Aftershock final, which may have made it an easier decision for them, I feel.
But I think Jellyfish did deserve that win. They did have more control in that fight. They were a more complete robot than Sabretooth. Again, I would argue that it's a win by default more than anything.
You would argue that, wouldn't you?
Well, if you're going to fight a robot that was not 2 hours before in pieces, not the same. But anyway, they did win it. The judges made the right decision to give it to Jellyfish. Well done them.
Now, the good news is that Sabretooth have come out of this with very few new repairs to do. So in theory, they're going into this Aftershock fight in decent nick, but that's not really turned out to be the case.
Well, theory and practice, very different things. Yeah, but at this point, although they've got 2 hours and they've got 2 hours again, I assume they've had about 4 hours to repair this thing. It's in such bad shape. There's just nothing. It's weeks of repair work to get that robot back.
And the most important thing is it needs a fresh drum.
Yeah, Yeah, exactly. It's they can't spin that at full speed anymore, because that would be so dangerous to do that. I can't believe they spun it at all. It's held together with belts, but
I mean, I'm guessing in terms of safety, it's fine to do it in the arena. It's not going to hurt anyone, but it's not necessarily going to be good for the robot either.
no. I mean, if you imagine if it's spinning at full speed and it shatters, a sizable amount of that matter is going to go into the robot, just it's going to blow up on itself, and that's not going to be good. So it's a lot, a brave thing to do to spin it at all, and they certainly can't spin it at full speed. So
maybe they could weaponize its rapid unplanned disassembly.
just try and time the rud at the for the right moment.
Just use it as a projectile weapon.
That's not allowed, though.
Only if you've designed it to do that. If it just happens to happen, that's probably fine. Just go out and just vaguely super glue the fixes on. But no, the final, it's exactly what you expect. They're immediately put on their back by the first hit. They're not really driving properly inverted, even though they claim to be invertible. Kill-A-Lot then decides to pick them up to add insult to injury. And that's all she wrote, really.
Yeah, I mean, that robot is technically invertible, but not really invertible. Aftershock is just having a laugh. This is another one of those fights that really makes you question, what's too much? When are you meant to stop? And you can sort of see as well at the very end of that where they're arguing, where he's like, no, you need to stop now, stop. And the guy driving carries on. It's interesting to sort of see that.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Will is just sitting there with the weapon spun up in case they do start moving again. I think Ian Thomas is being a little bit oversensitive there.
I think it's a classic father-son argument, that is. That's like both two very strong-willed men have slightly different ideas, and the smaller the difference in your idea, the more likely you are to argue.
But I think, on the whole, they're a team whose sportsmanship you can't really argue with. And one thing that we've seen from them in the last series, and we will see later in this series, is that they are absolutely fine with seeing their robot get smashed up. They know what they're getting into.
Yeah, I'm sure every team does, but yeah, they are good about that.
The real villain here is the format. We've never had this issue before because we've always had a straight knockout tournament. And if you're going to make robots fight again and again and again and then fight the same opponent again, these things are going to become more of an issue. So you either say you don't hit them up after the counter started, or you tell them they've got a free reign, but you don't do what you've got now where you've got this grey area for people to make judgment calls. Although it probably makes good telly.
It does make good telly. I think the format results in this kind of sort of grey area thing. I think it's a bit unfair that basically Aftershock got destroyed pretty early on and then couldn't really do anything about it for the rest of it.
Presumably you mean Sabretooth there, not Aftershock.
Yeah, sorry. Sabretooth destroyed pretty early on and got through to the final of that on luck more than anything. It's a shame. It's a really annoying side effect of the format. And the other annoying side effect that I would argue is bad television is having the same fight.
A worse version of it as well, because the first version was a better fight.
Yeah. It's, sometimes it's sort of interesting that maybe there's a bit of like a rematch and the person who lost the first time wins the second time. That's kind of, when that happens, it's more forgivable, but in general, it's not. I like rematches. I like the idea of having grudge matches and stuff, but I think they should be given the time to bring their robots back up to full spec. I guess it's just, the format is what it is. It's what the BBC have chosen to go with. I wonder if it's for efficiency reasons that they can sort of basically knock out a whole series in a couple of filming days. It's like over a weekend, isn't it? 4
or 5 days of filming in the end, I think. Certainly this series has been, but they've done some other stuff in with it that I won't talk about here.
Yeah, so it's sort of like limitations, pressures from all sides about how the format should be. I don't like it. I didn't like it last year. I don't like it this year. I probably won't like it for Series 10 because of exactly this. Yeah, there are elements of it I like. There are elements of it I don't like. I'd like to keep this format, but change the way they do the filming so that people get time to repair. What it does mean, and I do like this, is that it means we get to see 40 robots over the series. Okay, we see 20 of them knocked out after about a minute of fighting, but it gets more people coming through, and it means that we can have the jellyfishes of this world in there, and it doesn't impact the overall quality of the final in particular. You're not going to see a robot that doesn't deserve to be in the final. But you can have them there anyway and let them have their moment of competing. So, at the end of the episode, I feel the need, and you may or may not like this, I feel the need to give ratings. Ratings? For an episode. I feel the need to rate an episode. I feel it gives an audience closure. What kind of rating do you want? Do you want a thumbs up, thumbs down, an out of 10, 5 stars? What do you mean? I was going to leave that to you, because I imagined you resisting this, so I thought if I gave you an element of control, you'd be okay with it. Oh, God. You know me too well. I'm fine with rating. I wasn't expecting it. That's all. It's just I mean, we can rate them. I don't know how I'd rate them.
I mean, I think this is an excellent episode of Robot Wars. I think it is better than any episode in Series 8. And I now need to come up with a rating system in my head. I am going to give this episode 17 out of a possible 19 pit release buttons.
I enjoyed it. I think 17 out of 19 is a bit high for me. I'd probably maybe in the 15 kind of area.
Still pretty high.
Yeah, it was. You're right. It was a good episode. There was a lot of stuff. There wasn't too much shenanigans from the rules. There weren't too many judges' decisions, which is always a good thing, in my opinion. I always like clean wins. In fact, there was only one judge's decision, wasn't there? Or there are two?
Sabretooth versus Jellyfish.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, good range of robots. I would have liked to see Jellyfish and Nuts 2 spread out a bit more than they were, but that's life. Yeah, I'm going with 14. 14 pit release buttons out of 19.
I immediately regret that decision.
I can't even say it with a straight face. It's such a ridiculous rating system.
I'll come up with something new for next week, don't worry. Basically, what I've done, I've wanted to implement a rating system, but I'm refusing to make it comparable across episodes.
But surely, what I was about to say is you need a conversion system now. We need to. Well, if the next episode is a different rating system, surely you need to publicise a formula for converting one rating system to the other. We've got like an imperial and a metric rating system, and we need to be able to convert between.
Or, alternatively, I could design the new one in such a way that it is in no way comparable.
I look forward to hearing that.
I'll see what I can come up with.